Hey, what's going on? It's Riffy, getting ready to do Unit 2 Notes, Part 3. This is where we go through the connective tissue, muscle tissue, and neural tissue. It's the other 3 of 4 main categories of tissue. Remember, in Part 2 we covered epithelial tissue, so without further ado, here we go. Alright, so getting into connective tissue, what the first and foremost you need to understand is that it is the most diverse form of tissue in the body, meaning that diverse in structure and function, looks, and what it does. So if you think about it, just in general of what these easy connective tissues, easy to remember connective tissues are: bone, blood, fat, cartilage, and tendons. If you just simply think about what they do and the difference between bone and blood and the way they look, you can easily identify them as the most diverse type of tissues. But what you get is you get together you get extracellular protein fibers and what is called a ground substance that forms a matrix. Think about the matrix as the stuff that holds it all together. For instance, like in blood, your blood is divided into 3 parts. You have, or essentially 2 parts. You have formed elements and you have plasma. Plasma would be your ground substance or your matrix, and everything else is suspended within it. So let's continue. Connective tissue is distributed throughout the body, but it is never exposed to an external environment. Whereas in epithelial tissue, you remember, epithelial tissue is always exposed to some kind of external environment, whether it be the inside of a tube, the outside of an organ or structure. Connective tissue is typically going to be found underneath that epithelial tissue because connective tissue is highly vascular. This concept of having a lot of veins and blood vessels and things like that is what allows connective tissue to supply the nutrients to epithelial tissue. This is also where you're going to have your receptors for pain, pressure, temperature, and other sensations. So these are your receptors for feedback loops that are going to distribute information to the central nervous system or the control center for interpretation. So let's get into what they do for the body. One of the first and foremost things that they do is protection. They are some kind of physical protection for some of the soft internal organs. The biggest example of connective tissue for this is bones. I mean, if you think about it, bone is hard, it's dense, and what it does is it's one of its main jobs to protect whatever is on the inside of it. The best example is your skull. Just think about it, that your skull is there to protect your brain. The bones are not movable because you want to protect the brain. Other things it does is it protects, reduces friction or protects tissue from rubbing against other tissue, which then keeps it from being damaged. The biggest example here is cartilage, and it also protects you from microorganisms. White blood cells are part of your blood, which their main job is to actually attack foreign pathogens, which means that it's kind of like a 3-way protection. It's protecting your inside stuff from the external environment. It is protecting yourself from yourself with like bone-to-bone contact, and it's also protecting the inside of your body from microscopic organisms or pathogens. Looking at it here, there's some connective tissue, for example, bone in your spinal cord, in your spine, that your vertebrae actually wrap around your spinal cord, protecting it from damage. That is soft tissue. Again, also you have this vertebral disc right here. That vertebral disc reduces bone-to-bone contact, which then reduces friction and keeps that bone surviving. Here, an example of arthritis, which is a deterioration of cartilage in a joint. When you have a normal hip, like right here, its movement is fine and fluid. Here, when the cartilage is worn away, you get bone-to-bone contact, and that is extremely painful. And then you have an example of a white blood cell right here, and these are red blood cells. Notice the tremendous difference between the two in terms of size, because that is actually a real image. So other things that it does, it gives support. What it does is it serves to help give organs their shape. For example, areolar tissue forming in the cartilage of the ears and the nose. So you have areolar tissue and cartilage in your ears that actually give it this nice fancy shape. Also your nose right here. Your nose is mostly cartilage, as you can tell by moving it back and forth. Here you have your ears. You can distort your ears. You can puncture your ears with earrings, and they still will maintain their shape. So looking at it here, you'll notice that this is your skull. Your skull is composed of a lot of different bones, which we'll get into later, but that whole frontal part that you can move and manipulate, and you can actually feel it, that is cartilage, which is a connective tissue that gives your nose its shape. So rhinoplasty is when you have a nose job. They're not messing with the bones or the bone structure of your face. They're just molding and manipulating the cartilage of your nose. Other things they do, energy storage. This is where adipose tissue comes into play, or fat. So you have long-term energy storage. This is also how your food can actually be turned into lipids for long-term energy storage. And then your fat or adipose tissue has a secondary function, which is insulation. Keeps body heat from escaping. You got this wonderful picture of measuring body fat percentage, which is terrible. Then if you notice here, you'll see that the adipose tissue, or the subcutaneous fat, there's a difference between subcutaneous fat and visceral fat. Visceral protects your organs, insulates them, maintains temperature. The subcutaneous fat is an insulator or storage of energy from the outside world. Okay, another function is internal transport. This is where that fluid connective tissue comes into play. This is, it basically moves materials such as water, solutes. Remember, solutes are things dissolved in a solution. Things like glucose, sugars, proteins, things like that. Ions, and believe it or not, you actually have to distribute cells throughout your body. For example, your blood and your lymphatic fluid connective tissue actually moves white blood cells throughout your body to keep you protected. And then in times of infection, you can actually produce more white blood cells, which then more of that needs to be distributed throughout the body, so you have internal transport of your materials. Here's a diagram of your lymphatic vessels. What I want you to pay attention to is there's a couple main structures, particularly your spleen is a major organ of it, but your lymphatic system moves lymph, which is one of the fluid connective tissues of your body. It actually mirrors your cardiovascular system, or your blood vessel system. So just taking a look there. What it also does is connective tissue, believe it or not, serves to make connections. It can connect certain parts to other things. For example, ligaments connect bone to bone, and then you have tendons which connect muscle to your bone. For example, here's your hands and your feet are unbelievably how would you say this? Detailed in terms of tendons and connections because of the number of movements and motions and things that they have to do. So here's your Achilles tendon that you can feel in the back of your foot. It actually extends up to the back side of your bone. Very painful if that's ruptured or broken, but there are your feet making connections between the bones. Another thing is hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis, you also see this phrase as hematopoiesis, but your connective tissue, particularly your bones and the bone marrow of your bones, like long bones and a lot of flat bones, they produce red and white blood cells to circulate throughout your body. So here's some examples. There's only one type of red blood cell in the human body, but there are several different types of white blood cells, and they are specific to the type of pathogen or what they're supposed to be attacking and getting rid of. And then another thing is platelets. Platelets are used in the clotting factor. So what that leads us to is your first entrance card question. So I'll go ahead and read it to you. You can pause and kind of look it up, but you're going to answer it on the index card. Question number 1. Leukemia is a disease which results in the inability of bone marrow to produce red and white blood cells effectively. Is this disorder going to be classified as a connective tissue disorder? Whether or not you select yes or no, please make sure you explain your answer. Alright, so how do we classify, because you have to categorize anything in the human body in terms of tissue and where it goes and similarities and differences and things like that. So here's how we're going to classify connective tissue. You can take connective tissue and classify it into these very large groups, and then some of those super large groups have subcategories of them. So the very first big group we're going to talk about is called connective tissue proper. Basically, this is any kind of connective tissue that has what you would call like a syrupy, a very thick, viscous ground substance, and all the cells and fibers are distributed within the matrix. This can either be in an organized fashion or an unorganized or disorganized fashion. But example is the connective tissue that's just underneath your skin. You have fatty tissue, tendons, and ligaments. The first subcategory is that we have what is called loose connective tissue. This name is ungodly clever. It's actually very loosely put together. But it's also known as areolar tissue. Areolar is the more formal name, but it forms the layer that separates your skin from the underlying muscle. That helps reduce friction. It provides padding for the muscles between that and the skin. And the thing about it is it has a very ample blood supply. Keep in mind, epithelial tissue is avascular. It does not have its own blood supply. So the loose connective tissue works in direct contact with areolar tissue to provide it with the necessary nutrients it needs to survive. Here's an example of loose connective tissue. You'll notice you have things that are called fibroblasts. Those are cells that produce the fibers that you'll see, right, like elastic fibers and things like that. Neutrophils are white blood cells similar to mast cells. You have fat cells. So you have this wide range of cells distributed between collagen and all kinds of different elastic fibers within there. And it's very loosely packed together. Here's an actual picture. You'll notice you'll have the cells here. These could be white blood cells, or they're not adipose cells. These big fibers here, those are collagen fibers, and the very tiny ones here are elastic fibers. So you can see how it gets its name, loose or areolar tissue. Okay, the next one is called adipose tissue. So from here out, we're no longer going to call it fat. We are going to call it adipose tissue. The main function here is it provides some kind of padding or shock absorption or insulation or energy storage. The padding or shock absorption should be very obvious to you. Insulation is also a factor. It's not as big of a factor as it is for other animals, but with us it's more like the visceral adipose tissue is going to maintain a nice steady insulating temperature for your vital organs and of course energy storage. So this is what it looks like. If you'll notice, you will see all the different adipose cells. They are embedded with blood vessels, but these little dark purple circles that you see right here, those are actually the nuclei, and this is the cell membrane around them. But what's crazy is this little clearish substance here, that is the actual lipid or fat that's in there. And it's not that when you lose weight the cells don't disappear, it's that the amount of lipids stored within these cells actually decreases. Here's just another example. There's another blood vessel embedded within the adipose tissue, but all these really dark circles. I think it looks very scaly. Okay, then you have what is called dense connective tissue. So essentially there are three main categories which in this connective tissue proper. You have areolar, you have adipose, and then we're going to have dense connective tissue. Two types. You have tendons and you have ligaments. Tendons attach bone to bone. Ligaments are an extension of muscle, and they attach the muscle to the bone itself. If you're looking here, you can see where it gets this name, dense connective tissue. It is very densely packed. This would be a tendon. These fibers, these collagen and elastic fibers, are very packed in parallel and uniform in direction. You will see very, very little nuclei for these cells embedded within the tissue. And you will notice that if there are nuclei, they are very elongated. A lot of people will confuse tendon or dense connective tissue with smooth muscle tissue, and I'll point out a difference later in this slide. Okay. Here's another example. This would be a ligament. Notice how it's a little bit more disorganized, has a little bit more of a elastic fiber matrix to it. And now we're on to our second entrance card. So in this particular one, what I'm going to address is the fact that you're going to put this on the same index card as question 1 if possible. If not, just start another one. But question number 2. If you have a lack of vitamin C in the diet, it interferes with the ability of fibroblasts, which are cells that produce collagen fibers or elastic fibers, to produce actual collagen fibers. What effect might this interference have on connective tissue? So what I'm saying is, if you have a very low amount of vitamin C in your diet, it'll keep fibroblasts from producing collagen fibers. What kind of effect might this have on the connective tissue and the maintaining homeostasis? And we're going to follow that up with a third one. So answer this one also. Here we go. Which characteristic of cartilage causes it to heal significantly slower than bone? So what I'm telling you is cartilage heals way slower than bone, and you need to identify why that is true. Is it A, it is avascular and lacks a direct blood supply, meaning it is referring to cartilage. So cartilage is avascular and lacks a direct blood supply. Is it B, nutrients and materials needed for repair of cartilage reach the chondrocytes very slowly? Is it C, glandular secretion cannot reach the chondrocytes of cartilage? Is it D, all of the above, or is it E, answers A and B only? Make sure you write down your answer.